And we'll just upload it to the channel. But the next time you do this, it'll automatically have the, if you click on more, it'll say stream to third-party streaming service. You click on that, you give the stream key, you give it when it says stream URL, just give it the VGDC UCI YouTube homepage, which is like what's it, youtube.com/@VGDC or something like that. And then just hit save, and then it'll start recording to both of those at the same time. Let's do that. So you don't even need to hit recording because it will automatically save the VOD to the YouTube channel when I'm done. And yeah, those captions.
Oh, we haven't shared the screen.
Oh, yeah, that is kind of important, isn't it? Whenever you share the screen, just make sure to share sound and optimize video clip. Even if you don't have shares, even if you don't have sound or videos, it just helps improve performance all around the screen entirely. I'll just do the slideshow to get some settings. Share. Slideshow. This is not.
I checked it. This is the caption to show up.
Or, well, is it using the correct audio source?
Oh.
Oh, that's. It's using the one for the video camera. That guy.
Oh.
Okay. Without further ado, now you're using.
They will music real quick. Escape doesn't work?
It doesn't work?
Oh, there we go. All right, let's get started. Welcome to the Writing Week 2 workshop. Today's topic is narrative structure and outlining. So what is story structure? Well, for people who don't know what story structure is or who are new to writing, this is the definition from Google. Quote, the structural framework that underlies the order and manner in which a narrative is presented to a reader, listener, or viewer. In layman's terms, that basically means the format of the story. The most simple story has a beginning, middle, and an end. Unless you are J.J. Abrams and you subscribe to the mystery box method of storytelling, where there is no end and you keep raising questions, more questions than you answer. I could go on a rant about this, but in order to conserve time, let's move on. Okay, a little 1 minute rant. So J.J. Abrams, his mystery box style storytelling, it focuses on like a dangling plot thread or some intriguing concept, but it doesn't really explore the story or characters in any meaningful way. So it's like, oh, what's gonna happen? He's like, yeah, he dangles like a carrot, but he doesn't fully answer it. And so it might leave people unsatisfied by his like conclusions. Most famously, I think he was the creator of the show Lost. And I know that I haven't watched it personally, but I know that the show is, I think it was criticized for its ending because like it didn't really satisfy like the audience. It didn't come to a satisfying conclusion. So basically, in my opinion, don't use his method of storytelling. Focus on the characters and the story you're trying to tell.
You want to direct game analogy, it's the Scott Cawthon method of storytelling. Actually. Never answer questions. Or if you do answer a question, make sure to raise 3 times as many questions in the process, where it's just a branching gigantic tree of nonsense and lore that doesn't connect with one another. But because you never answer any questions, you can't get in trouble when people question your logical sense.
Yep, exactly. Now we have the basic plot triangle here. You've probably seen this in English class many times before in your life. It's also called the 5-stage story structure. So we have the beginning or the exposition, which is where you set up the world, you set up the context of the world and your character. And then it leads to the rising action, where you kind of introduce the conflict of the story, and which leads to the climax, where the main character faces off against a conflict. It can be like external, it can be any type of conflict, like man versus self, or like man versus man, like any type of conflict. Leads to the falling action, and then finally the resolution or end of the story, where you wrap everything up and the main character is changed by the end. So now we have Joseph Campbell's monomyth, which is basically the hero's journey. The monomyth is just a fancy word for it. So every major film franchise you loved probably follows this structure. It follows like one character going on like an adventure, and it focuses on them and their growth. You can see by this graphic here, there's 3 different franchises as an example here, laid out in this structure. We have the classic Star Wars from 1977. We also have Harry Potter and that entire franchise. And then we also have Lord of the Rings, which all kind of follow this structure. And this structure basically follows the 3-act structure, which I will get into later in this workshop. However, structure isn't everything. I'm gonna pivot a little bit and talk about outlining when it comes to writing. So on this chart, there's 2 opposite ends of how you outline as a writer. On the far right, you have the plotter or architect, which basically means you want to structure every plot detail and character detail like in advance. You want to plan everything out. You know where the story is going, what happens at this point of the story and what happens at that point of the story. Or you could be a discovery writer or pantser, which is an interesting word, or gardener, where you basically make it up as you go along, or you don't really have a set structure of like where your story is going to lead or where your character is going to go. It's like you open up a blank document and you just write whatever that comes into your head, like the story you're trying to tell. Or you can fall somewhere in the middle of the spectrum where you kind of do a bit of both. You could plan out some character traits, or like you know what your characters are going to be, but like where they are going in your journey, you might like not know exactly, and you might, just whatever comes to your mind for inspiration, you might just do that. Feel free to just, yes. Oh, sorry. Feel free to just try multiple methods when you're outlining. It could lead you to becoming a more visceral writer in the end.
So the writing director from 2018 to 2020, Megan, she was such a plotter. She would make entire Spotify playlists for each of the characters in her story that were meant to symbolize their character arc. So I remember she showed me one once that was supposed to be about like a kid who went to like a magic academy who like had fire powers and whatnot. So all of it was just like a refusal to call a song, like not going to do it or something like that. And in the middle, it's like Girl on Fire by Alicia Keys. Then it went into like the conflict. Their dad died. So it's just like, I don't know, Cancer by MCR or something like that. And then it just like kept going, like it followed the 5-act structure. But as a freaking Spotify music artist, she was that dedicated to plotting every single detail. These were the songs that her characters would listen to on a daily basis if they had the technology and whatnot. It's like, there are some limits to just how plotty you can be, but she was gonna find those limits. God dang it.
Yeah, personally, I would say I'm somewhere in the middle. I like to figure out my characters first, but then like the overall story, I guess it just comes to me as it goes.
And there is no definitive right or wrong answer. I will say though, if you're more in the green side with the discovery writer, game studios, especially AAA studios, are gonna freaking hate your guts. Because they like structure in AAA studios, wouldn't you know it? Tossing around millions of dollars in budget. But in your own personal works, like with VGDC and whatnot, it's perfectly fine to be a gardener and whatnot. But once you get into industry, you might want to start getting more towards the right. It's
hard for you know what you're doing. You're like, trust me.
Oh yeah.
One part.
Studios love it when you do that. They love the auteur.
Yes. All right. More on outlining. So outlining is very important because when you're a writer, you're most likely going to be working on a team. It's very rare that you're going to like solo dev an entire like indie game, although you can do it if you're just good enough. So communication is essential. So your team needs to be on the same page as you, which means that you have to make an outline and share it with your team. And you have to make sure that your story and your character writing is cohesive with the entire game. So like the game designers, the audio engineers, they need to understand what you're trying to do, and like they can implement it with like the game mechanics, such as, you know, walking or reaching a certain point in the game. And you can use these structures that help with outlining, but you don't have to follow them exactly. You see this meme on the bottom right of the slide from one of my favorite films, the first Pirates of the Caribbean. It's where Barbossa talks to Elizabeth, and he's like, narrative structure is more what you call guidelines and actual rules. That is totally the quote that he said in the movie. And yeah, just you don't have to feel constricted by structures, but it's a helpful tool.
Personally, my favorite quote from the movie was, "I'm gonna catch that pirate of the Caribbean." But that's just me.
Yes, when that happened, I teared up. Okay, now for the 3-act structure, I'm gonna break it down. Okay, Act 1 is where you establish the world. So you establish the main character, you establish how they live, their needs, their wants, like who they are as a person. And basically you establish like the status quo. And then you want to have an inciting incident. An inciting incident is like an event that sets the plot or the story into motion and hooks the audience into the story. I have 3 different examples of an inciting incident. One is from the Mario movie, one is from Firewatch, and one is from The Last of Us. Has everyone in this room seen the Mario movie? Okay, then I wouldn't want to spoil it for you, so I guess we can skip that if you want. Okay, and I'll just talk about Firewatch and The Last of Us. So an inciting incident in Firewatch is when you play as Henry, you're like a lookout on the watchtower, and then on your first day, when you're doing, you know, watchtower stuff, and you come back, you see a mysterious figure like kind of just looking at you creepily, and that's like it hooks you in because like you as the player, you don't know what's going on. You're like, who is this? Like, are they gonna hurt me, or what, is this just like a random like creep? So that gets the audience like excited into your story. And for The Last of Us, it's when Joel like meets Ellie for the first time. He's given this mission to transport her across the country to the Fireflies. And this is like setting up the relationship and the journey of these 2 characters. Yeah. This is usually the point of no return, where like they can't really go back. They have to move forward in the story. And yeah, and it's where the main character starts off on their journey. Act 2, we'll disregard the Mario stuff again, but basically the protagonist tries and fails to overcome like the conflict that happens in part 1 or Act 1. They gain new skills and learn lessons that will help them against the conflicts. But be aware of pacing, because like Act 2 is, I would say, is the longest act. It's like 50% of your story. But it also has a chance to like feel bloated or like meander for bits. So you want to keep your writing sharp and like know where the characters are going in your story. In Act 2, there's usually increased stakes and pressure on the protagonists, like more challenges that they have to face. You could put a supposed victory here, which basically means you think the protagonist is going to win, or win or overcome the conflicts, but it's a fake out because it doesn't actually happen, and it leads to stuff hitting the fan, or it's called the dark night of the soul, where everything gets worse and it feels like nothing can get. It feels like the protagonist is going to lose, and nothing can get worse than this. Any questions or comments so far? Cool. Which leads us to Act 3. Act 3 is the climax of the story, where the protagonist faces off against the main conflicts. It usually ties up all the subplots from the previous acts. And there is a resolution at the end of Act 3, where like the protagonist is changed or grows. The bottom image is a frame from Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. How many of you seen it? Cool. It's one of my favorite recent movies. This is when Miles Morales as Spider-Man faces off against Kingpin. And it's where he overcomes all his obstacles and defeats him at the very end. Spoiler alert. So is that all it takes to write a story? Just putting this character on an adventure? No, you can't do that. So why do we care about the story? We actually don't. That's all external plot, which means external plot is the stuff that happens to the characters or the stuff that they have to do. But what really matters are the characters itself and the internal conflict. Internal conflict is like the struggle happening inside of the character, who they are, how they feel about what they're going through, their wants, their needs, their flaws. You only care about the story if you care about the characters. So external conflict is still needed, but it's the catalyst that forces the character to deal with their true internal conflict. So here's a quote from a very famous movie critic, but I think it applies to just storytelling in general and game writing and game story as well. So Roger Ebert says, "We are all born with a certain package, who we are, where we are born, who we are born as, how we are raised. We're kind of stuck as that person. And movies are like a machine that generates empathy. And this is for games or any other type of art form. If it's a great movie, it lets you understand a little bit more about what it's like to be a different gender, different race, a different age, economic class, nationality, profession, hopes, dreams, fears. It helps you empathize with them because we all have internal conflict in our lives, or like stuff we want to do, or we all have wants, needs, and fears. So sum it up, actual story is what the characters are going through. How do they overcome that? So
people here actually know who Roger Ebert is. One, two. Yeah, so back in like I want to say like the 80s, mid 80s, maybe mid 90s, he did a like movie critic review show essentially with some other guy whose name I forget because he's dead.
Gene
Yeah.
Siskel.
Their whole thing it was out of 4 thumbs up. So if you've ever seen reviews from RogerEbert.com, it's always out of 4 instead of like out of 5. And they never do like percentages because it's thumbs. So it's like 1 thumb out, 2 thumb out, 3 thumb out. Yeah. My side over, but that's who Roger Ebert is. It's very movie critic world. Yeah.
So let's go back to Act 1. We've already established the external world, but we have to establish the internal conflict, which is within the character. So like it's the character's misbelief quote about the world. So what's wrong with their life? Like what are they struggling with? And what's stopping them from living their best life? Do they have trauma? Like do they have insecurities? Are they grieving? What is like in their life that's like going wrong? And what is it that they need to overcome? So we talked about the external inciting incident. Also, like internal exciting incident is you want to force the protagonist to face their fears that they've been avoiding. So like you have to make your character confront your difficulties, their trauma, etc. And it's okay to punish your characters and make them feel uncomfortable, because like it's easier for the audience to empathize with them, because we all have been through struggles and stuff. And so like it's easier to empathize with someone who's going through similar struggles as you. Moving on to Act 2. So remember when the protagonist fails to overcome the conflict in Act 1? It's because they're struggling with something that they can't get over, and they're internally conflicted. And so, yeah, adding a supposed victory. If you add a supposed victory, it's impactful because like the protagonist thinks that they can achieve their goals without overcoming their internal conflicts, but they can't. And it forces them to reflect on themselves and face it head on as you go through the Act 2 into Act 3. All right, let's do this one last time for Act 3. For the climax, the protagonist should confront their fear head on. And when they do this, it's like this climactic moment, the quote unquote final battle, where they conquered both their external conflicts and resolves their inner conflict. And the resolution, the end of the story, the protagonist has to change from the beginning to the end. And they have to learn from the journey and is a different person. If a person doesn't change in a story, it's not really an impactful story. It's just like events that happen in a person's life. So you want to have character arc, character growth. Yeah, and you have to make your protagonist change. That being said, we want to consider scope when we're writing, because most of us are doing VGDC or indie games. So we probably won't be using like a full, deep, like a hero's journey or 3-act structure that's like multiple pages, like 10+ pages. But we can still create engaging characters, history, lore in a 10-week-long project. You want to closely talk to the game designer and flesh out your characters. And so like, and have like a minimal story, but it can still be impactful. And you want to make sure your story fits in the game. So how we do this for smaller games is we have a simple 3-act structure. Act 1 is like level 1. It's like you set up everything, you set up the world, you set up the characters where they're at. And then Act 3 is like the final level, the climax, the completion of an arc. And Act 2 is just like any levels you can get and make in between Act 1 and Act 3. You want to write what you can within the scope of your game. And it's also a good tip to plan out the beginning and end of your story. So it's easier to be flexible with your team if things change, like if there's like difficulties in designing or implementing, or if your game goes in a different direction, you can like account for that, because the middle of their story is not set in stone yet. All right, in conclusion, narrative structures such as the hero's journey and the 3-act structure are just tools to kind of organize your thoughts. Every movie every game story, every movie is different. They don't always follow these structures to a T. They can take away bits that don't fit their story, or they can add some bits that are missing from these structures. So just do what feels right for your story and characters. Trust your instincts. If you think you have a good story you want to tell, focus on like the theme or the message of the story, and then just trust your gut as you write, and yeah, iterate and edit your writing. And these also could be good jumping off points to start from if you're lacking inspiration. Like if you have a bunch of ideas in your head and you don't know where to go with where to start, you can just like follow a simple 3-act structure and plot out character moments, character beats, and stuff like that. All right, so this is the end of like the lecture. Do you have an activity for you? So the activity is to write a little bit. So make up a completely original story and outline it right on the spot using either one of the narrative structures I've talked about, or just you can make your own, or pick a favorite movie, book, TV series. I forgot a game series or any game, and break down its story structure. And yeah, excited to see what you come up with if you choose to participate. You. Hopefully that was helpful. I will end the recording now. Thank you for coming to the workshop.